Next, I'd like to introduce Richard Morningstar, founding chairman of the Global Energy Center at the Atlantic Council. Richard also previously served as ambassador to the European Union and to the Republic of Azerbaijan. Ambassador Morningstar, please join us. Take it away.
Okay, thank you very much, Vicki. I hope you can hear. Can you hear me okay?
I do hear you, and I believe our audience can hear you unless they tell me otherwise.
Okay, well, thank you very much. This is a very important time for this conference. And let me just see, is the video on? Because it's not on my screen, but in any event.
I can see you.
Okay, all right.
Our
I guess I
technical
just
support.
I guess I just won't see myself, which is maybe
Oh my
a good.
goodness. Okay.
Anyway, there really couldn't be a more important time for this conference and to discuss what we'll be discussing for the next few minutes, given the war in Ukraine and the energy crisis, which really started well before the war in Ukraine. Uh, and let me just start by making a few comments on maybe some obvious things that we've learned. One is that fossil fuels, oil and gas, for the short to midterm, are going to continue to be critically important. Having said that, at the same time, the energy transition and accelerating the energy transition is even more important. Fossil fuels and the energy transition is not an either or situation. We have to work in tandem and to decarbonize fossil fuels as much as possible. For example, setting standards with respect to gas, setting standards on methane, carbon capture, eliminating flaring, and any number of things. So why am I saying this? First of all, gas and oil continues to be obvious, is critical for energy security, to maintain economies, and it's necessary to provide necessary energy to consumers. We're seeing the inflationary effect that the energy crisis has had, that the Ukraine war is having, all going to show how important it is to deal with fossil fuels. But at the same time, I want to emphasize that we have to double down on the energy transition, not just from the standpoint of climate, which is obviously critical, but also particularly in Europe with respect to energy security and to reduce dependence on Russian energy imports. So what does Ukraine tell us? First and foremost, it seems to me it tells us that Europe must once and for all eliminate its dependence on Russian energy. There's been some progress, some good progress over the last 8 or 10 years, particularly since the Ukraine shutoff in 2009. So that's actually 13 years ago, but still much more needs to be done. Europe has plans to do that by accelerating the energy transition, focusing on energy efficiency, pushing on renewables, building new infrastructure, alternative supplies of fuels, reinstating some nuclear plants, and focusing on new technologies. Obviously, this is not going to happen. This is not going to happen overnight. But Europe needs to accelerate these efforts and do these things as quickly as possible. And it's an area where the United States and the EU in particular can work together in accomplishing these goals. So where are we with respect to sanctions? Russia is still receiving huge revenues from both oil and gas, although there's been maybe some reduction in exports of oil and will continue to be more as it becomes more difficult. Given the price, Russia is still achieving very high revenues, both in both oil and gas. Europe is trying to establish an oil embargo, which I'm sure you've all been reading about, but with difficulty. There are some countries that feel that they're so dependent on oil and they're landlocked and get their oil through the Druzhba pipeline from Russia, that they can't agree at this point to an embargo. That would include Hungary, and obviously there have been lots of problems with respect to Hungary and Viktor Orban and their dealings with Russia, but they are landlocked and do need oil. The Czech Republic, Slovakia, Bulgaria are all in this position. So Europe is trying to work through how to establish that embargo, what kinds of extensions to give to these countries, how to get it done, and it's unclear whether that's going to happen. So, which raises another question: is, well, what does the United States do about it? One can argue, and it is somewhat appealing, that the United States establish some kind of Iran-type oil embargo. And with secondary sanctions. That would have an effect on India and China, and that would be difficult. And with respect to Europe, if Europe does not establish its own oil embargo, member states can certainly reduce consumption. And if the U.S. Establishes a sanctions regime, European countries can receive exceptions. As long as they're reducing imports of oil. So one of the issues that raises, it's a little different than Iran, in that if the U.S. acts on its own, even giving exceptions to the EU, what does that do to the necessary unity between the U.S. and European countries with respect to the Ukraine war? How much good will this do? And should the emphasis be more on providing weapons and security for Ukraine, and that is what can ultimately achieve success? It's a difficult issue, and it's nuanced. And my own view is that every effort should be made to reduce Russian revenues, and that may in fact include a U.S. sanctions regime, but it should be done and must be done in cooperation with Europe. Gas is more difficult. Europe is also committed to phasing down gas over time, and they have, again, the kinds of steps that I mentioned before would help to achieve those goals. And they want to be not taking any Russian gas by 2030. Easy to say. Steps need to be taken. Strong steps, which I already described. Some to increase LNG, increase infrastructure, and the other steps with respect to the energy transition are going to be critical. There's been a lot of discussion about maybe there should be a tariff regime, basically charge a 50% tariff. That's a hypothetical number on Russian gas. Setting up an escrow account where purchases of gas, or for that matter oil, would go into an escrow account, and monies could be used to help reconstruction in Ukraine. Price caps, all of that sounds interesting, and I guess have some possibilities, but I think they're going to be very difficult to accomplish. First of all, I question whether Russia would play in the game with respect to any of those, if any of those devices came to pass. I can't imagine Russia agreeing to sell gas where money is only going to go into an escrow account and then goes to Ukraine, or for that matter, sell gas if there's a 50% tariff or 75% tariff, and who's going to pay for that, and how much of a discount would Russia need to take? So I think that would be very difficult to accomplish. I think that it's going to be really important for the EU working together with the U.S. to reduce exports by some of the steps that we've already spoken about. But I think it's also key from an EU standpoint that these goals can't be just aspirational. They need to be concrete, and they need to be accomplished. And I do think that the EU has shown really a remarkable turnaround with respect to some of these issues, particularly in Germany and in other countries. There are steps that can be taken, but again, one of the concerns being, I hope Europe doesn't step back, and a lot of that will depend on what happens in Ukraine. For example, if Ukraine turns into more of a frozen conflict at some point along certain geographical lines, will Europe start paying less attention and try to go back to the old ways? If nothing else, I hope that this won't happen, and that Europe will never again be dependent on Russian exports. That doesn't mean or imports from Russia. That doesn't mean at some point that EU countries cannot buy Russian energy at competitive prices, but depending on the geopolitical situation, but there just can't be dependence. Those are my few comments at this point. I know this was supposed to end at 12, but we started a little late. It's 12:01. If there's time for some questions, I'll leave it to you, Vicki, to see if anybody wants to raise any points or ask any questions if there's still time.
Thank you, Investor. We certainly have time for you, and we're certainly grateful that you would be speaking with us this morning. And you mentioned, the fossil fuels are critically important. The energy transition is even more important maybe at this time. And I'm thinking critically about this time. We've been talking about these issues for some time, moving in a certain direction and all of that with climate change and all of that. But there seems to be a need for a careful balance. And I use the word careful, maybe thoughtful. I guess you could wordsmith that as we go forward, as we move forward. But as we move forward at this juncture, in geopolitics. Much of the world, I think, I don't think, but I know was taken aback when Russia invaded Ukraine. Did you see yourself any advanced signs of this? And as you're thinking, and watching, as we watch the world's response, and you've mentioned some things, would you have additional advice for the U.S., the European countries? Maybe there's a particular country that you're looking at, Germany or others, seeing how they are going to react and move forward in different ways. So maybe just give you an opportunity to talk a little bit more about your reaction after the invasion.
Okay. First of all, it's interesting. You use the word careful balance between fossil fuels and the energy transition. I used that term internally with our group, and somebody said, "Well, maybe balance isn't the right word, because that sort of indicates that one might be at the expense of the other." I'm not sure I agree with that. But I do think the point is that we need to concentrate on both. That the energy transition is absolutely critical. At the same time, from an energy security standpoint, we need, particularly like gas in Europe, but also oil, and that we need to take the steps as possible to reduce gas and oil. But in the certainly short to midterm, it's going to have to be there, and we have to try to decarbonize those efforts or those fuels as much as possible. And we could get more end to that. I've heard others say that it's additive, the energy transition plus gas, for example. Anyway, we could talk more about that. Yeah, I've thought about the whole European energy security for years. In fact, at the beginning of the Obama administration, I was uh, Hillary's envoy for Eurasian energy, and which meant dealing with countries from Europe through, Central and Eastern Europe, Russia, the former Soviet Union, and so on. And so I've been preaching this issue of dependence for years now. And as I said, some progress has been made. And we, the US, can work together with Europe to achieve some of the steps necessary to reduce that dependence. But I'll never forget that I was at a meeting with a session with Hillary when she was Secretary of State at the UN during the UN General Assembly. She was meeting with all of the EU foreign ministers and said, and it's so true, we can't want energy security for Europe more than Europe wants it. So I think there has been a shift as a result of the Ukraine war. That shift has been seen most in Germany. There have been a lot of mea culpas coming from German officials who said, yeah, we relied too much on this being a commercial issue and the economics and so forth, and should have paid more attention to the geopolitics and so on. So Germany seems committed at this point to eliminate that dependence. The thing that worries me, as I said before, I just hope that continues, that countries don't go back to the old ways if things settle down a little bit in Ukraine, so that it's not it stops being a front page story and goes more into a frozen conflict. I hope things do settle down in Ukraine. Don't get me wrong, but not to the point that old habits, not that old habits would come back, and that Europe has to stay committed in a very concrete way to reducing that dependence.
Mhm. Ambassador, you've had a very tenured and distinguished international career. One I recall reading about from afar and not having known you personally, but and you've strung in your comments and your answers, you've kind of given an indication of your vision. Um, what's your long-term vision? I'm sure there have been many experiences and events that stand out, and maybe there's one that stands out as being the most significant. But as we go forward, and we must go forward, can you tell us about your long-term vision for the Global Energy Center at the Atlantic Council, or in other terms?
Well, from the standpoint of a long-term vision, maybe it's the same for the Global Energy Center as well as overall. And maybe going back to what you said a few minutes ago, that we need to take a balanced approach towards energy. That it has to be, but again, when we talk about balanced,
Right.
I mean additive.
Right.
That that it really does need to be, I think, an all of the above
Wow.
approach to meet our goals. And that includes doing everything we can, particularly with gas, to decarbonize gas. It includes, obviously, renewables. Uh, it involves new new technologies such as hydrogen. I think that nuclear has to be part of the mix. I think it was a huge mistake on the part of Germany when it shut down all of its nuclear plants after Fukushima. Uh, Nuclear is a clean technology. Yes, there are risks that need to be dealt with, but there are also new technologies that can be very helpful. And the whole area of research and technology is another area where the U.S. and Europe uh, uh, can work together. Uh, so you know, when I started up the Global Energy Center 7 years ago, just from my background, it was mainly focusing on the geopolitics of energy, which will continue to be important and continue to be important, not just with respect to oil and gas, but with respect to the energy transition, how we work with developing countries to meet climate goals and so forth. But we have expanded to that all of the above approach. We're probably focusing more, I would guess 80% of our work is in the area of the energy transition and new technologies. And that will continue.